Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, reflecting on this editorial over here, proudly placed on the front page of decibelmagazine.com. The new Prurient album is too long, in case you guys didn't know. New Prurient album out this year. It's just short of 3 hours, and according to this editorial over here, it's too long. That's all there is to it. It's too long. Open and shut case. It's too long of a friggin' record. Geez. What is the reasoning behind this? Prurient, if you didn't know, is an experimental and a noise music project that has been running for a long time now. In 2015, Prurient dropped an album titled Frozen Niagara Falls, which was one of my favorites of that year. And that album is 90 minutes. And even this piece says that is too long. So here we go. Next month, Prurient will release a 3-hour-long record. Want to make sure you guys can see that. That album is too long. Admittedly, I haven't heard Rainbow Mirror. Yes, I know 2/3 of you have just clicked away, but I hope the rest of you will follow me here. And that's the thing. This album is not even out yet. So how we're supposed to decipher whether or not it's actually too long, I don't really know. But yes, according to this person who has not heard this album, and I've not heard this album either, see, nobody has, it's not out, the album is too long. Then he goes on to describe that this album is a part of a trend of a lot of very long albums being released these days, which I do agree with that in a sense. There have been a lot of very long album releases coming out lately, and I think that's partially due to the digital age. Sure, a lot of this stuff has come out physically, but labels are not really printing physical copies like they used to. You know what I mean? It's not as big a monetary risk to print a very long vinyl record for a limited and a passionate and a hardcore group of fans than it used to be, when you used to have to print tons and tons and tons of copies in anticipation or with the hope that people are actually going to purchase the thing. You drop a 3-hour album, you put it up digitally, people buy it digitally. There's no sort of back end to that. I mean, there is a little back end to it, but there's not a whole manufacturing process to sort of making that happen. It's all digital. It's all ones and zeros. So I feel like that makes it easier to drop an album like Drake's More Life, which is essentially just a long filler project, or the new Janae Aiko record, which is just like 90 minutes of these forgettable, kind of very ambient, very spacey R&B tracks that don't really have a whole lot in terms of songwriting or flavor. It all sounds very casual. It all sounds very off the cuff. And for me, a lot of artists who are doing this sort of thing, Chris Brown is another example, who dropped like a 2.5-hour record recently. It seems like what a lot of these artists are doing is just like kind of stream trolling a little bit. They're putting out these long projects, and Chris Brown is definitely guilty of this because he instructed his fans to buy the album and then after that go stream the album on Spotify or Apple Music or whatever your music streaming platform of choice is. So he's not telling people to buy the album and then listen to the copy of their album that they bought, but buy the record, then go and stream the album all the way through so that he gets all these streams, all these numbers for the Billboard charts on these streaming services. So in a sense, it's kind of stream trolling. However, I don't really see that is going to be the case with Prurient unless he's dropping all of these like 1-minute tracks on this 3-hour album or something like that. Because Prurient most likely is going to be writing a lot of long, noisy, experimental compositions on this thing. So I do agree with the complaint that he's making in a sense, but he's not really connecting it to anything. He's just saying, hey, albums are getting really long, and I'm not going to try to contextualize that at all. I'm just going to say albums are getting too long. And basically he goes on to say that it is unreasonable to expect a functional adult who is going to work and paying bills and blah, 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 to listen to an album all the way through that's really long. And it's just a really silly argument. It's just a really silly point. Like, then he goes on to say, here are things that you could do that take about the time of the Prurient record that you could do instead of listening to the Prurient record, which is kind of gross for a few different reasons. Number one, we haven't heard the Prurient album, so we don't know how good it's going to be. To me, whether or not an album is too long depends mostly on its quality, or whether or not it's continuing to deliver interesting ideas across the length of the composition. For me, an album is too long if it's 5 hours long and it's a boring 5 hours. If a record is 5 hours long, but it's like an amazing 5 hours, it's the most amazing 5 hours of music I've ever heard, I mean, how can I say that that album is too long? Because the length is a part of the experience. And as long as the experience is a positive experience, then the length must have had a positive impact on the experience being as good as it is. To say that, I'm trying to think of an example of a track that's amazing, but it's an incredibly long track. I guess you could probably say, maybe the title composition or the theme composition off of Godspeed, You Black Emperors, like Lift Your Skinny Fists or whatever. Like, that's a long composition, but a very entertaining one. And to say that, well, maybe it would have been just as good if shorter is kind of a gross way to approach the creative, the recording, the artistic process of that. And I feel like he's kind of making that same argument here, but with even more ignorance because he hasn't heard the album. And then he says, here are things that you could do instead of listening to the album. This to me says that you don't really prioritize music that much. And not that people need to prioritize music so much that a Prurient album fits into their day that is almost 3 hours long. It's not for everybody. It's not for everybody. It's not going to be for everybody. A Prurient album isn't going to be for everybody, much less a long Prurient album. But the thing is, listen, taking a yoga class versus taking the time to listen to a Prurient album, that's just priorities. You just do one or do the other depending on what your preference is. Neither is better than the other. And he's sort of making this assumption here that doing a yoga class would be more significant or be more important than listening to a Prurient album. What if the Prurient album is really good? What if you really enjoy the Prurient album? What if you fucking hate yoga? I mean, I listen to music all the time when I'm exercising, running, lifting weights, over here doing like some push-ups and stuff in my office or whatever. And I pretty vividly remember a lot of my initial listening sessions to that last Prurient record, the 90-minute album, Frozen Niagara Falls, being sort of at the gym. And given Prurient's musical style, it's very noisy, it's very ambient, it's very kind of spacey and abstract. I feel like that kind of music can be listened to in a number of different contexts. Like, it doesn't necessarily require you to listen to it as intently as like a finely tuned and a methodically crafted classical piece. There's certainly room for thought and contemplation and just kind of maybe a little bit of spacing out, because that's sort of the mindset that the musical tone and the structure of this kind of music begets. And honestly, like, to be complaining about albums being too long, the last Prurient record, the new Prurient record, which 90 minutes and almost 3 hours respectively, that just kind of barely scratches the surface of what qualifies for long music. Like, what about the 4 different movements of William Basinski's Disintegration Loops? What about that 6-hour-long Flaming Lips track? What about that 24-hour-long Flaming Lips track? What about the new Kamasi Washington album, or, the last one, the Epic, which is 3 hours long? It's 3 different discs. Pretty much every new record that Swans has dropped. There are so many great, fantastic, long albums out there. The new Big Crit album. My buddy Austin was turning me on to this Jurg Frey record that is a 6-hour-long electronic tape piece. This one dude who I follow on Bandcamp, Impossible Nothing, drops these incredible, massive, weird, experimental electronic music, like beat music pieces, where it's just like one track, like 20 tracks, almost 30 tracks, and each track is like 10 minutes long. What about Little B's, like some of his longest mixtapes? What about 05 Fuck 'Em? I think that mixtape is like over 5 hours long, more than 3 hours long. I think it's over 5 hours long. Listen, I'm not going to say that I've listened to these projects a million times, but a lot of these projects I have listened through at least one time, and my experience coming away from them was mostly positive. Like, I wouldn't have traded my experience with with those records for a single yoga class, honestly. And again, not to shit on yoga, not to say that yoga's bad or anything like that, but I don't think we should necessarily value albums based on how convenient it is to listen to them all the way through. And honestly, with the Prurient over here, I don't even think it's that inconvenient to listen to the record, because this album, Frozen Niagara Falls, and most likely the new record, are going to be split up into discs. I know I myself, when I'm listening to albums like this, or I'm listening to something like the new Kamasi Washington album, or I meant the last one, the Epic, I just listen to a single disc. You know, sometimes I'm in the mood for the chill, laid back, very glamorous, and more melodic third disc of the project. Sometimes I'm more in the mood for the epic and the densely instrumentally packed first disc of the album. Maybe I'm more in the mood for the muscular, lean, and more aggressively performed second disc of the album. Depending on what my mood is, I kind of listen to each disc separately. That's also kind of the case for the new Big Crit album, also kind of the case for the last Prurient record, also kind of the case for some of the new material that Swans has put out. Listen, if you really want to listen to the stuff, you just kind of make the time for it. The one record recently that I wouldn't say is too long, but I had a difficult time fitting it into my schedule was probably the new Autechre record, which was, 5 almost like hour-long discs or whatever. And, it was just because it would have thrown my review schedule off a little bit too much, that I would have had to cancel a bunch of reviews in order to fit that review into my review schedule, and I wasn't really getting that many requests for it at the end of the day, so the incentive wasn't really there for me to do it. But if there was some kind of guarantee, or if I was getting so many requests for that album, that or if I really had such a burning passion for that record, and I knew I was going to get 100, 200, 300,000 views or something out of a review of that project, I would have reviewed it hands down, no question. 5 hours long. Fuck it. Let's do it. So, listen, I mean, the new Prurient album, it just barely scratches the surface of what makes for long music, long form music, extremely long music. And because it's not out yet, because you haven't heard it, because I haven't heard it, we don't really truly know whether or not it's too long. If it ends up being a very long, boring slog, and it's a very uninteresting 3 hours, sure, you can argue that point, you can make that point. But until you've actually heard the friggin' thing, how do we know whether or not it's too long? You can't just take the runtime of an album and say it's too long. It's too long for what? What is it too long for? Like, if you want to have a singular experience with a record, then just make the time to do it. How much time do you spend bullshitting on Twitter? How much time do you spend binging some fucking show on Netflix? You'll watch 5 fucking hour-long episodes of some fucking show on Netflix in a row, but you're like, an album's too long. Like, listen, it's not that it's easy to sort of clear out time, but it's all about priorities. Like you said toward the back end of this article, you could watch this Russian amateur art film that lasts 2 hours and 45 minutes. And you could do that. And if you did do that, that would be totally fine. But if you just listen to the Prurient album instead, that's fine too. That's just priorities. How could you make the argument earlier saying that somebody doesn't have 2 hours and 40, you can't be a functional adult and just set aside 2 hours and 45 minutes to listen to a Prurient album when you tell them later in the article that they can set aside that same amount of time to watch some art film. So, I mean, do we have the time or do we not have the time? You can't make the argument that we don't have it and then say, hey, you actually do have the time. Use it instead to do A, B, or C. Obviously, there are some things that here you should that are listed here that are important. Like, hey, maybe you should sign up for Obamacare. Maybe you should register to vote. As long as you're doing stuff like that, why not list here, do the dishes? But honestly, like, you could put a fucking album on like a friggin' Wi-Fi or a Bluetooth speaker and do the dishes then and listen to the record. So, I mean, listen, in these instances, take advantage of the fact that music can be enjoyed in a number of different contexts, especially music like the music Prurient makes, because it does have a more ambient and an experimental and an abstract tone to it. And listen, if you care about music, whether it's long or it's short, you make the time for it. If you don't really care about music that much, which I assume the person who wrote this editorial doesn't, because of the tone of the editorial. Maybe he doesn't care about music that much. Maybe he just doesn't care about Prurient's music that much. Then you're not going to make the time for it. And that's okay too. Just admit that that's how you feel rather than telling other people that the album is too long for them. Over here is another video next to my head that you can check out, or you can click on the link to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys in the next one. Tell me down in the comments, what makes an album too long? Is the new Prurient album too long? Is it too long? And what is your favorite longest album? I'll see you guys in the next one. Forever.